I folded voter registration forms at the community center every Tuesday and Thursday, wearing the same faded campaign t-shirt from 2016, and nobody bothered to learn my name. They called me the quiet volunteer, or that lady who comes early. But when the county clerk stepped up to the microphone and announced, "This year's Civic Leadership Award goes to General Elena Carter," the room went silent, because the woman they'd been treating like she didn't understand basic civics wasn't supposed to be folding registration forms at card tables. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside Community Center smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaning supplies, with fluorescent lights that buzzed just loud enough to give you a headache if you stayed too long. I'd been volunteering there for 8 months, showing up at 7 in the morning to help set up tables for voter registration drives, citizenship ceremonies, and town halls that drew maybe 30 people on a good day. The regular staff treated me like furniture, pleasant enough but forgettable, the way people treat someone they assume has nowhere more important to be. My name is Elena Carter, but the volunteer coordinator, Mrs. Henderson, had been calling me Ellen for 6 months, and I'd stopped correcting her around month 3. It seemed easier than explaining that details mattered, that precision in communication could mean the difference between success and catastrophe, that in my previous life, getting someone's name wrong could compromise entire operations. But that life felt like it belonged to someone else now. Someone who wore uniforms instead of thrift store cardigans. Someone who briefed senators instead of stuffing envelopes. I kept my head down and my mouth shut, the way I'd learned to do since moving to Riverside Falls 3 years ago. Small towns have their own rhythm, their own social hierarchies, and I'd discovered that being new, being quiet, and being a woman of a certain age made you essentially invisible. Which was exactly what I'd wanted when I'd bought the little house on Maple Street with cash and told the realtor I was looking for somewhere peaceful to retire. The other volunteers were mostly retirees themselves, well-meaning people who'd lived in Riverside Falls their entire lives and knew everyone's family history going back 3 generations. There was Dorothy Michaels, who ran the local historical society and had opinions about everything, from the proper way to hang bunting to why young people didn't appreciate civic duty. Frank Morrison owned the hardware store and served on the city council, a man who spoke with the authority of someone who'd never been contradicted about anything more significant than the best brand of lawn fertilizer. Then there was Patricia Kelman, Mrs. Henderson's sister-in-law, who coordinated most of the voter outreach efforts and had a way of explaining basic concepts to me like I'd just arrived from another planet. She'd lean over my shoulder while I was organizing registration packets and say things like, "Now, Ellen, you'll want to make sure people understand they need to bring identification," as if I hadn't been handling similar logistics for longer than she'd been married. They meant well, I kept telling myself. They were doing important work, and if they treated me like the helping hands rather than the thinking brain, that was probably my own fault for not speaking up, for not establishing myself as someone worth listening to. But every time I opened my mouth to offer a suggestion based on experience they couldn't imagine I possessed, something held me back. Maybe it was the weight of carrying secrets I could never share, or maybe it was just exhaustion from a lifetime of being the only woman in rooms full of men who'd assumed I was there to take notes. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I arrived at the community center at 7 sharp, unlocked the side door with the key Mrs. Henderson had reluctantly given me after I'd proven I was reliable, and began setting up tables in the main hall. We were preparing for the county's annual Civic Engagement Fair, a day-long event that brought together voter registration, local government information, and what the flyers optimistically called community dialogue about the issues that matter most. I was arranging voter registration materials when the first crisis hit. The electronic voting machines that were supposed to be demonstrated had arrived the night before, but nobody could figure out how to set them up. Frank Morrison was standing over the equipment looking frustrated, muttering about instruction manuals written by people who'd never operated anything more complicated than a toaster. "These things are supposed to be user-friendly," he complained to Patricia, who was hovering nearby with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she was mentally rehearsing how she'd explain this disaster to the county clerk. "But look at this interface. How's anyone supposed to navigate all these menus?" I glanced over at the machines from my station at the registration table. They were standard electronic voting systems, the kind I had helped evaluate during my time consulting with the Department of Homeland Security on election security protocols. I knew those machines better than I knew my own coffee maker, had spent months testing their vulnerabilities, training election officials on proper procedures, writing reports that had influenced purchasing decisions in 43 states. But Ellen the volunteer wasn't supposed to know that. "Maybe we should call the tech support number," Patricia suggested, though her tone suggested she'd rather call in a favor from the Almighty. I watched Frank struggle with the machine for another 5 minutes, inserting the wrong access cards, pressing buttons in sequences that would have locked the system down if it had been in actual election mode. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "Excuse me," I said, approaching their little crisis huddle. "I might be able to help with that." Frank looked at me like I'd offered to perform brain surgery with a butter knife. "That's very sweet of you, Ellen, but these are pretty sophisticated pieces of equipment." "I'm sure they are," I replied, keeping my voice even, "but I've worked with similar systems before." Patricia exchanged a look with Frank that I pretended not to notice. "Well, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to let you take a look," she said in the tone people use when they're humoring someone they don't want to disappoint too harshly. I moved to the machine and ran my hands over the interface, muscle memory kicking in as I located the administrative access panel. Within 30 seconds, I had the system powered up and running through its diagnostic sequence. Within 2 minutes, I had it configured for demonstration mode with sample ballots loaded and ready for public interaction. "How did you stopped staring at the machine like it had performed magic. "The interface is actually pretty intuitive once you understand the logic flow. You just have to think about it from the user's perspective rather than the administrator's." Patricia was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Where exactly did you say you worked before you moved to Riverside Falls?" I hadn't, and I wasn't planning to start now. "I did some consulting work, government contracts, mostly administrative stuff." That seemed to satisfy them, or at least they decided not to push further. But I noticed that for the rest of the morning they watched me differently. Not with respect, exactly, but with the wariness people develop when they realize they might have misjudged someone.
The fair opened at 10, and by 11 the main hall was filled with the kind of civic-minded citizens who actually show up to events like this. Mostly older residents, a few young families with children who seemed more interested in the free balloons than the democratic process, and a handful of college students from the community college who'd been offered extra credit for attending. I spent most of the day at the voter registration table, helping people update their addresses, explaining the difference between party affiliation and voting eligibility, and answering questions about polling locations. It was satisfying work. The kind of hands-on civic engagement that felt more meaningful than the policy papers and strategic briefings that had filled my previous life. But as the day wore on, I started noticing things that bothered me. Procedural irregularities, security gaps, administrative shortcuts that might seem harmless in a small town, but could become serious vulnerabilities in different contexts. The voter registration database was being accessed on an unsecured laptop. Personal information was being discussed within earshot of random attendees. Paper registration forms were being left unattended while volunteers took breaks. I mentioned a few concerns quietly to Mrs. Henderson, framing them as questions rather than criticisms. Should we maybe keep these completed forms in a locked box? Is that laptop password protected? Do we have a chain of custody procedure for the registration materials? She smiled at me with the patience of someone explaining reality to a child. "Ellen, this isn't the Pentagon. These are our neighbors, people we've known for years. We don't need to treat voter registration like it's some kind of covert operation." But that was exactly the problem. Election security wasn't about paranoia or distrust. It was about protecting the foundation of democratic participation from people who absolutely would exploit any weakness they could find. I'd seen what happened when election officials got complacent, when small vulnerabilities snowballed into systematic compromises that undermined public confidence in the entire process. I bit my tongue and went back to folding registration forms. The event was winding down when County Clerk Margaret Stevenson arrived for the closing ceremony. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd held the position for nearly a decade, respected for her efficiency and her no-nonsense approach to election administration. I'd never met her personally, but I'd read her reports, knew her reputation in professional circles where election security was taken seriously. Mrs. Henderson had set up a small podium at the front of the hall, and the remaining attendees gathered around as Clerk Stevenson prepared to make some closing remarks. The usual thanks for participating, reminders about upcoming elections, encouragement to stay engaged in local government. Then she paused, looking down at her notes with an expression that suggested she was about to deviate from her prepared remarks. "Before I close," she said, "I want to take a moment to recognize someone who's made exceptional contributions to civic engagement and election security, not just here in our county, but across the entire state and beyond." I was only half listening, mentally calculating how long it would take me to finish cleaning up my station and whether I'd have time to stop at the grocery store before heading home. This year's recipient of the State Civic Leadership Award has spent more than 20 years strengthening democratic institutions, training election officials, and developing security protocols that protect the voting rights of millions of Americans. Her work has been instrumental in maintaining public confidence in our electoral process during some of the most challenging periods in our nation's recent history. A few people started clapping politely. The most of them looked as puzzled as I felt. The State Civic Leadership Award wasn't something that usually got announced at small-town voter registration events. "Clerk Stevenson, can you please join me up here?" The applause stopped. The room went completely silent, and 30 pairs of eyes turned to look at the quiet volunteer who'd been folding registration forms in the corner all day. I stood there for a moment, feeling like I'd been caught in a spotlight I'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. Mrs. Henderson's mouth was hanging open. Frank Morrison looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Patricia Kelman was staring at me with an expression that cycled rapidly through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been embarrassment. "General?" Mrs. Henderson finally managed to whisper. I walked slowly to the front of the hall, each step feeling like I was crossing years instead of yards. When I reached the podium, Clerk Stevenson extended her hand with a smile that suggested she'd been looking forward to this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the room, "General Elena Carter served as the Deputy Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where she led the development of election security protocols used in all 50 states. Before that, she was the Director of Strategic Planning for the National Guard Bureau, coordinating emergency response efforts for natural disasters and security threats across the country. Her holds a doctorate in public administration from Georgetown and has been recognized by 3 different presidential administrations for her service to democratic institutions." The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, could hear someone's chair creaking as they shifted uncomfortably, could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. General Carter retired from federal service 3 years ago, but her impact on election security and civic engagement continues to be felt across the nation. Local election officials still use training materials she developed. Security protocols she designed are protecting polling places in communities from Alaska to Florida. And apparently, she added with a slight smile, she's been volunteering her time to help register voters right here in Riverside Falls. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out at faces that had transformed from familiar to foreign in the space of 5 minutes. Dorothy Michaels was staring at me like I'd revealed myself to be an entirely different species. Frank Morrison had that deer-in-the-headlights expression that comes from realizing you've been explaining basic concepts to someone who literally wrote the book on the subject. "Thank you, Clerk Stevenson," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected.
And thank you to everyone here who's been working to support voter registration and civic engagement. This kind of grassroots work is the foundation of everything else we do to protect democratic participation. I paused, looking around the room at people who'd spent months treating me like a well-meaning amateur. I know this might come as a surprise to some of you, I continued, and I caught Patricia wincing slightly. But I want you to know that the work you're doing here matters just as much as anything that happens in Washington or at the state level. Every voter you register, every question you answer, every problem you solve contributes to the strength of our democratic institutions. You don't need to be a general or have a doctorate to make a difference in your community. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then stronger as people seemed to process what they'd just learned. But I could see the questions in their faces, the confusion about why someone with my background had been content to fold registration forms and stuff envelopes for 8 months without saying anything. After the ceremony ended and most of the attendees had left, Mrs. Henderson approached me with an expression that mixed embarrassment with something that might have been awe. "Elena," she said, using my correct name for the first time, "I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say anything about your background?" I finished stacking the unused registration forms before answering. "Because you didn't need to know," I said finally. "The work needed to be done regardless of who was doing it, and sometimes it's better to be underestimated than to spend all your time managing other people's expectations." Frank Morrison had been hovering nearby, clearly wanting to be part of this conversation. "But you could have helped us avoid so many mistakes," he said. "All those times we struggled with procedures or protocols, you could have just told us the right way to do things." "I did tell you," I replied gently. "You just weren't ready to hear it from Ellen, the volunteer." That landed harder than I'd intended, and I watched Frank's face flush as he realized the truth of it. How many times had I offered suggestions that had been dismissed or ignored? How many small improvements had I proposed that had been set aside because they'd come from someone they'd assumed didn't understand the complexities of election administration? Patricia Kelman had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, but now she stepped forward with an expression that suggested she was wrestling with something difficult. "I owe you an apology," she said bluntly. "We all do. We treated you like you didn't know what you were talking about. You treated me exactly the way most people treat volunteers, gratefully, but without much curiosity about what else they might bring to the table." "But why?" Mrs. Henderson asked again. "Why volunteer for voter registration when you could be consulting for the state or working for campaigns or doing something that matched your qualifications?" I looked around the community center, at the folding tables and the hand-drawn signs and the coffee-stained voter registration materials. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was real in a way that policy papers and strategic briefings never quite managed to be. Because this is where democracy actually happens, not in Washington, not in state capitals, but in community centers and school gymnasiums and church basements, where neighbors help neighbors exercise their most fundamental right. You can design all the security protocols you want, but if people can't actually register to vote, or if they don't understand the process, or if they don't feel welcome when they show up, then none of the rest of it matters. Over the following weeks, things changed at the community center, but not in the ways I'd expected. Mrs. Henderson didn't suddenly start deferring to my expertise, and Frank Morrison didn't begin treating me like an oracle of civic wisdom. Instead, they began asking different kinds of questions, listening to my suggestions with the attention they deserved, and incorporating my feedback into their planning processes. More importantly, they began treating me like a full partner in the work, rather than helpful hands attached to an empty head. When we planned the next voter registration drive, Patricia asked me to review the security procedures. When questions came up about election law, Mrs. Henderson called me before calling the county clerk's office. When college students asked about careers in public service, Frank made sure to introduce me as someone who could speak from experience. But the most significant change was in the conversations we had during the quiet moments between events. Dorothy Michaels started asking me about the places I'd lived and the work I'd done, genuinely curious about experiences she'd never imagined. Frank wanted to understand how federal agencies actually functioned, how decisions got made, how policy translated into practice. Patricia was fascinated by the behind-the-scenes work of election security, the threats most people never heard about, the precautions that protected democratic processes without voters even realizing it. I found myself sharing stories I hadn't told in years, remembering aspects of my career that had gotten buried under the weight of leaving it behind. The late nights spent developing contingency plans for everything from cyber attacks to natural disasters. The satisfaction of watching election officials implement protocols that would protect millions of votes. The frustration of knowing how vulnerable our systems could be while watching political leaders dismiss security concerns as partisan paranoia.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Do you miss it?" Mrs. Henderson asked one Thursday afternoon as we were setting up for a naturalization ceremony. "The federal work, I mean, being in charge of important decisions." I considered that question while arranging informational pamphlets about citizenship responsibilities. "I miss the scope of it sometimes," I admitted. "The feeling that the work you're doing today might prevent problems that could affect thousands or millions of people. But I don't miss the politics, or the bureaucracy, or the pressure to make everything fit into neat little boxes that can be explained in 30-second sound bites." "But you gave up so much influence," Patricia pointed out. "Out here, you're just one voice among many." "Out here, I'm working directly with the people who make democracy function," I corrected. "In Washington, I was writing memos about voter registration procedures. Here, I'm actually helping people register." There's something to be said for cutting out the middle layers and focusing on the work itself. The truth was more complicated than that, of course. I'd left federal service because I'd grown tired of fighting battles that seemed to have more to do with political positioning than actual problem-solving. I'd watched too many good ideas die in committee, too many essential programs get defunded for reasons that had nothing to do with their effectiveness, too many dedicated public servants get burned out by systems that rewarded appearance over substance. Moving to Riverside Falls had been my way of stepping back from all of that, of finding work that felt meaningful without being consumed by the machinery of government. The voter registration drives, the citizenship ceremonies, the civic education events might have seemed small compared to briefing senators or coordinating with state election officials, but they were also immediate and tangible in ways that policy work never quite achieved. "You know what I think?" Dorothy said one day as we were cleaning up after a particularly successful registration drive. "I think maybe we needed you more than we realized, but you needed us too." She was right, though I hadn't quite understood it that way until she said it. Working at the community center had reminded me why I'd gotten into public service in the first place, had reconnected me with the fundamental purpose that had gotten lost somewhere in the maze of federal bureaucracy. These people cared about democracy not because it was their job or their career, but because they understood instinctively that citizenship required participation. 6 months after the awards ceremony, I was asked to speak at the State Election Officials Conference about grassroots voter engagement strategies. Standing at the podium in front of 300 county clerks, registrars, and election administrators, I talked about what I'd learned from working at the ground level, about the gap between policy and practice, about the importance of understanding how procedures actually worked in community centers and town halls rather than just on paper. But the most important part of my presentation wasn't about election security or administrative efficiency. It was about the danger of underestimating the people who show up to do the work, regardless of their credentials or their backgrounds, about how much expertise gets overlooked when we make assumptions about who has something valuable to contribute. The most effective voter registration drive I've ever participated in, I told that audience of professional election administrators, was run by a retired hardware store owner, a historical society volunteer, and a woman who introduced herself as just someone who wanted to help. They didn't have advanced degrees in public administration or decades of experience in election security, but they understood their community better than any consultant could, and they were willing to do the work that needed to be done. I paused, looking out at an audience that included people I'd worked with for years, people who knew my background and my credentials. I learned more about effective civic engagement in 8 months of folding registration forms than I had in the previous 8 years of writing strategic plans, I continued. Not because the strategic planning wasn't important, but because I'd lost sight of the human element that makes all the procedures and protocols meaningful. After my presentation, several conference attendees approached me with questions and comments. But the conversation that stayed with me came from a young county clerk from a rural district who'd been struggling with voter outreach in her community. "General Carter," she said, "I've been trying to increase registration numbers in my county for 2 years, and I keep hitting the same walls. People don't trust government officials, don't want to fill out forms, don't think their votes matter. How do you bridge that gap?" "Stop being a government official," I told her. "I don't mean quit your job, but when you're doing outreach, be a neighbor first. Show up not because it's your responsibility, but because you care about the same things they care about. Let them see that you're willing to do the work alongside them, not just tell them what they need to do." She nodded thoughtfully. "Like volunteering at community events instead of just organizing them?" "Exactly," I said. "Be the person folding registration forms, not just the person explaining how to fold them." That conversation reminded me why I'd initially resisted revealing my background to the volunteers at the community center. There's something powerful about being underestimated, about being seen as just another person willing to help rather than an expert with an agenda. When people don't know your credentials, they respond to your character instead, and sometimes that leads to more honest and productive relationships. But there's also something important about eventually being seen for who you really are, about having your full experience and knowledge valued rather than dismissed. The volunteers at the community center had needed to learn that lesson just as much as I'd needed to remember why the work mattered in the first place. Now, 3 years after that initial awards ceremony, I split my time between the community center and consulting work with election officials across the state. I still show up on Tuesday and Thursday mornings to help with voter registration, but I also travel to small counties that are struggling with security protocols or administrative challenges. I train local election officials on procedures I help develop, but I also learn from them about implementation challenges I'd never considered. Most importantly, I've stopped trying to choose between being General Carter and being Ellen the volunteer. Both of those identities represent different aspects of the same commitment to democratic participation, different ways of contributing to the same essential work. The volunteers at the community center still tease me occasionally about my dramatic reveal, and Frank Morrison has never quite gotten over the embarrassment of explaining basic civic procedures to someone who had literally written federal guidelines on the subject. But they've also embraced the opportunity to learn from someone with different experiences, and I've embraced the opportunity to see my own work through their eyes. "You know what's funny?" Patricia said recently, as we were setting up for another citizenship ceremony. "I used to think the most important thing about voter registration was getting the paperwork right, making sure people filled out the forms correctly, checking all the boxes, following all the procedures. And now?" I asked. "Now, I think the most important thing is making people feel like their participation matters," she said. "The paperwork is just the mechanism. The real work is helping people understand that they belong in this process, that their voices deserve to be heard." That's exactly the lesson I'd been trying to learn myself, the reason I'd been willing to spend months being underestimated and overlooked. Democracy isn't sustained by experts and credentials and strategic plans, though all of those things have their place. It's sustained by ordinary people who show up to do extraordinary work, who believe deeply enough in the process to invest their time and energy in making it function.
Sometimes the person folding registration forms at the corner table knows more about election security than anyone else in the room. Sometimes the quiet volunteer has spent decades protecting the democratic institutions that make local civic engagement possible. And sometimes being underestimated is exactly the perspective you need to remember why the work matters in the first place. The next time you're at a voter registration drive or a town hall or any other civic event, pay attention to the people who seem to be just helping out. Ask their names, listen to their stories, and remember that you never know who might be standing next to you, ready to share decades of experience if you're willing to treat them as more than just helpful hands. Because in the end, democracy works best when we recognize that everyone has something valuable to contribute, regardless of their titles or their credentials or the assumptions we make about their backgrounds. The most important civic leadership often happens quietly, without recognition or fanfare, by people who show up simply because the work needs to be done. The real test came 6 weeks later, when the state announced emergency changes to voting procedures just months before the midterm elections. New security requirements, updated technology protocols, and revised registration deadlines that would affect every polling location in the county. The kind of systematic overhaul that usually took years to implement was being compressed into a timeline that made experienced election officials break out in cold sweats. County Clerk Margaret Stevenson called an emergency meeting for all local election coordinators, volunteer organizations, and community leaders. The conference room at the county building was packed with people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, facing binders full of new regulations that seemed to change everything they thought they knew about running elections. The state legislature passed these modifications in response to federal cybersecurity recommendations, Stevenson explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent the last week trying to make sense of mandates that had clearly been written by people who'd never actually administered an election. We have 90 days to implement new voter verification systems, upgrade our registration databases, retrain all poll workers, and redesign our entire ballot delivery process. Frank Morrison raised his hand from the back of the room. Margaret, with respect, 90 days isn't enough time to retrain our volunteers, let alone overhaul our entire operation. Some of our poll workers have been doing this the same way for 20 years. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Dorothy Michaels was shaking her head with the expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. Patricia Kellman was frantically taking notes, as if writing everything down might somehow make it more manageable. "I understand the concerns," Stevenson replied, though her tone suggested she shared them completely. "But these aren't suggestions from the state, they're requirements. If we don't implement these changes correctly, we risk losing our certification to conduct elections, which means no polling locations, no voter registration, no democratic participation for our entire county." Mrs. Henderson leaned over and whispered to me, "Elena, you must have dealt with situations like this before. How do you even begin to tackle something this massive?" I'd been sitting quietly in the middle of the room, listening to the panic build as people realized the scope of what they were being asked to accomplish. The truth was, I had dealt with situations exactly like this, but usually with teams of specialists, unlimited federal resources, and timelines measured in years rather than months. Watching a small county try to implement the same level of systematic change with volunteer coordinators and donated coffee felt like watching someone try to perform surgery with kitchen utensils. "The key is breaking it down into manageable components," I said, loud enough for the room to hear. "You can't implement everything at once, but you can identify the critical path items that have to happen first to enable everything else." Stevenson looked at me with the expression of someone who just spotted a life preserver in rough water. "General Carter, would you mind sharing your thoughts on prioritization?" I stood up, feeling 30 pairs of eyes focus on me with a mixture of hope and skepticism. These people had known me as Ellen, the volunteer, for months before learning about my background,
and some of them were still adjusting to the cognitive dissonance of asking someone they had been explaining basic procedures to for help with complex administrative challenges. The first thing you need to understand is that these requirements weren't designed by people who've ever run elections at the county level. They're written by cybersecurity specialists and policy analysts who think in terms of theoretical best practices rather than practical implementation. That doesn't mean they're wrong, but it does mean you'll need to translate between what they're requiring and what's actually possible in your specific context. I moved to the front of the room, where Stevenson had spread out flowcharts and implementation timelines that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never seen a rural polling location. For example, I continued, picking up one of the new voter verification protocols. This requirement for biometric confirmation sounds very sophisticated, but what it actually means is that you need to verify that the person requesting a ballot is the same person who registered to vote. In a community where poll workers have known most voters for decades, that's not a technology problem, it's a documentation problem. Frank Morrison leaned forward in his chair. So you're saying we don't actually need fingerprint scanners? You need to be able to demonstrate that you verified voter identity according to state standards, I clarified. But the method for doing that verification can be adapted to your local circumstances as long as it meets the security requirements and provides adequate documentation. For the next 2 hours, I walked the room through each major requirement, translating bureaucratic language into practical procedures, identifying which changes were genuinely necessary and which ones were compliance theater designed to make legislators feel like they were taking action. By the time we finished, the binders full of incomprehensible requirements had been transformed into a workable implementation plan that actually made sense for a county with limited resources and volunteer staff. But the real work was just beginning. Over the following weeks, I found myself pulled deeper into the election preparation process than I'd ever intended.
What had started as offering advice during volunteer meetings became consulting on database security protocols. What began as explaining new requirements became training poll workers on verification procedures. What should have been helping with voter outreach became coordinating with state officials who were struggling to implement their own mandates. The problem was that Riverside County wasn't unique. Small counties across the state were facing the same impossible timeline, the same resource constraints, the same disconnect between what the requirements demanded and what was actually achievable. State officials were fielding dozens of calls every day from election administrators who were drowning in new procedures they didn't understand, implemented with technology they couldn't afford, according to timelines that ignored the realities of local government. "We need your help," Margaret Stevenson said during a call that came at 7 in the morning on a Thursday that I had planned to spend organizing voter registration materials. Not just with our county, but with the state implementation. The Secretary of State's office is asking if you'd be willing to serve as a liaison between the counties and the state compliance team. I was standing in my kitchen, still in pajamas, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I listened to Stevenson explain how the entire state election system was teetering on the edge of collapse because of well-intentioned requirements that no one had figured out how to actually implement. "Margaret, I retired from federal service specifically to avoid these kinds of systemic crises," I said, though even as I said it, I knew I was going to say yes. I moved to Riverside Falls to fold voter registration forms and help people understand polling procedures, not to redesign state election infrastructure. "I know," she replied, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "But there are 67 counties in this state, and maybe 5 of them have election administrators with the kind of background needed to navigate these changes. The rest of us are flying blind, and if we can't figure this out, we're going to have polling locations shutting down and voters being disenfranchised because we couldn't translate federal security requirements into procedures that actually work." She was right, and we both knew it. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same expertise I'd been hiding behind volunteer work was exactly what was needed to prevent a disaster that could undermine democratic participation from millions of people. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Come to the state capitol next week. Meet with the compliance team and the county coordinators. Help us figure out how to make this work before we run out of time." 3 days later, I was sitting in a conference room in the state capitol building, looking across a table at 23 county election officials who were varying degrees of overwhelmed, frustrated, and terrified. The state compliance team had prepared a presentation that might as well have been delivered in a foreign language for all the practical guidance it provided. "These protocols represent industry best practices for election security," the lead compliance officer was explaining, clicking through slides that showed theoretical network diagrams and abstract security frameworks. "Implementation should be straightforward for counties with adequate IT infrastructure and trained technical staff." The county official from Millfield, a rural district with a population of 8,000, raised her hand. "What if we don't have IT infrastructure or trained technical staff? What if our entire election operation runs on 2 computers and a volunteer who used to work at Radio Shack?" The compliance officer looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if he'd never considered that elections might be administered by people who didn't have computer science degrees and unlimited budgets. "Well," he said after a pause, "you'd need to acquire the necessary infrastructure and training to meet the compliance requirements." "With what money?" asked the official from Riverside County, a woman who'd been running elections for 15 years and had never encountered a problem she couldn't solve with common sense and determination. "Our entire annual budget for election administration is less than the cost of one of these new verification systems." That's when I realized that this wasn't just an implementation problem, it was a fundamental disconnect between policy and reality. The people designing the requirements had never worked in a county where the entire election staff consisted of a part-time coordinator and a dozen volunteers who showed up because they believed in civic duty. They'd created solutions for problems that existed in major metropolitan areas and assumed they could be scaled down to communities that operated on completely different principles. "May I suggest a different approach?" I said, standing up from my position at the side of the room where I had been listening to this train wreck unfold. The compliance officer looked at me with the expression of someone who was hoping for rescue but wasn't sure it was coming from a credible source. "General Carter, we'd welcome your input." Instead of trying to force every county to implement identical solutions, we need to develop scalable compliance frameworks that achieve the same security objectives through different methods. A county with sophisticated IT infrastructure and full-time technical staff can implement biometric verification and real-time database synchronization. A county with 2 computers and volunteer poll workers can implement enhanced identity verification and manual audit procedures that provide equivalent security through different mechanisms. I moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room and started sketching out a framework that separated security objectives from implementation methods. The goal isn't to make every polling location look identical. The goal is to ensure that every vote is secure, every voter is verified, and every process can be audited and validated. There are multiple ways to achieve those objectives, and the best solution for each county depends on their specific resources, infrastructure, and circumstances. For the next 4 hours, we worked through county-by-county implementation plans that adapted state requirements to local realities. The rural counties with limited technology would implement enhanced paper-based verification systems with rigorous audit procedures. The suburban counties with moderate resources would use hybrid systems that combine technology upgrades with traditional verification methods. The urban counties with substantial infrastructure would implement the full digital solutions that the compliance team had originally envisioned. By the end of the day, we had a framework that was actually achievable, with timelines that made sense and resource requirements that matched what counties could realistically provide. More importantly, we had buy-in from county officials who finally understood what they were being asked to do and felt confident they could actually accomplish it. But implementing the framework was going to require more coordination than the state compliance team could provide and more technical expertise than most counties possessed, which meant that my quiet retirement from federal service was about to become significantly less quiet. "We need you to lead the implementation team," the Secretary of State said during a phone call that evening. "Not as a federal consultant or a private contractor, but as someone who understands both the policy requirements and the practical constraints. Someone the counties trust because you've been working at the ground level, but who has the background to coordinate with federal agencies when necessary." I was standing in my kitchen, still in pajamas, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I listened to Stevenson explain how the entire state election system was teetering on the edge of collapse because of well-intentioned requirements that no one had figured out how to actually implement. Margaret, I retired from federal service specifically to avoid these kinds of systemic crises, I said, though even as I said it, I knew I was going to say yes. I moved to Riverside Falls to fold voter registration forms and help people understand polling procedures, not to redesign state election infrastructure. I know, she replied, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. But there are 67 counties in this state, and maybe 5 of them have election administrators with the kind of background needed to navigate these changes. The rest of us are flying blind, and if we can't figure this out, we're going to have polling locations shutting down and voters being disenfranchised because we couldn't translate federal security requirements into procedures that actually work.
This was about protecting the fundamental right of every citizen to participate in democracy, regardless of whether they lived in urban districts with unlimited resources or rural communities where elections were run by volunteers who bought supplies with their own money. What would the position actually involve? I asked. Coordinating implementation across all 67 counties, providing technical assistance to local election officials, serving as a liaison between county, state, and federal compliance requirements, training election workers on new procedures, troubleshooting problems that arise during implementation, basically being the person who makes sure this actually works instead of being another unfunded mandate that sets counties up for failure. It was exactly the kind of position I would have designed for myself if I'd still been working in federal service, the bridge between policy and practice that was so often missing from government implementation efforts. But it was also exactly the kind of high-profile, high-stress responsibility I'd retired to escape. I need to think about it, I said. Of course. But Elena, we need an answer by Monday. The election is 96 days away, and every day we spend trying to figure out coordination is a day that counties lose for actual implementation. That weekend, I found myself having conversations I'd never expected to have. Mrs. Henderson stopped by my house with a casserole and a dozen questions about whether I was going to abandon the community center work that had become such an important part of both our lives. Frank Morrison called to ask if taking a state position meant I'd be too busy to help with the citizenship ceremonies scheduled for the following month. Patricia Kellman sent a text message that simply said, "We need you here, but we understand if you need to go where you can help more people." The conversation that mattered most happened on Sunday evening, when Dorothy Michaels knocked on my door with a bottle of wine and an expression that suggested she had something important to say. "I've been thinking about what you told us after the award ceremony," she said, as we sat on my back porch watching the sun set over the community garden that had been built on the lot behind my house. "About how democracy happens in community centers and church basements, not just in government buildings." I remember. "Well, it seems to me that right now, democracy needs you in government buildings," she continued. "Not because the work at the community center isn't important, but because if counties can't run secure elections, there won't be any democracy to protect at the local level." She was right, and I'd been avoiding that conclusion all weekend. The voter registration drives and citizenship ceremonies and civic education events that had become so meaningful to me couldn't happen if election systems collapsed under the weight of requirements that no one knew how to implement. The work I loved at the community level depended on infrastructure that was failing because of the disconnect between policy and practice. But what if I take the state position and become just another bureaucrat pushing requirements that don't make sense? I asked. Dorothy smiled and took a sip of wine. "Elena, you spent 8 months folding voter registration forms before anyone knew you had a doctorate in public administration. I don't think there's much risk of you losing sight of what actually matters." Monday morning, I called the Secretary of State's office and accepted the position of State Election Implementation Coordinator, with 2 non-negotiable conditions. First, I would continue volunteering at the Riverside Falls Community Center because staying connected to ground-level work was essential for understanding whether state-level solutions actually functioned in practice. Second, the implementation framework would prioritize local autonomy and resource constraints over standardized procedures,
because effective election security required solutions that worked for actual communities rather than theoretical models. Both conditions were accepted without hesitation, which told me something important about how desperate the situation had become. My first official day in the new position began at 5 in the morning with a conference call involving county election officials from across the state, federal compliance monitors, and technology vendors who'd been contracted to provide equipment and training that most counties couldn't afford and didn't need. The disconnect between what was being offered and what was actually required was so vast that I spent the first hour just translating between different groups who were supposedly working toward the same goals. The federal compliance standards require real-time database synchronization across all polling locations, the technology vendor was explaining to a county official whose entire district had 3 polling locations and no internet infrastructure. What we actually need, I interjected, is a verification system that ensures voter eligibility and prevents duplicate voting. Real-time database synchronization is one way to achieve that goal, but it's not the only way, and it's not necessarily the best way for counties with limited connectivity. But the federal standards specifically mention database synchronization, the vendor insisted. The federal standards mention database synchronization as an example of acceptable verification methods. They don't mandate specific technologies, they mandate specific security outcomes. Our job is to help counties achieve those outcomes using methods that actually work in their specific contexts. That pattern repeated itself dozens of times over the following weeks. Technology vendors pushing expensive solutions that solved problems most counties didn't have, federal monitors interpreting requirements as narrowly as possible to minimize their own liability, state officials trying to satisfy federal mandates without understanding local implementation challenges. County election administrators caught in the middle, trying to run actual elections while navigating bureaucratic requirements that seemed designed by people who'd never seen a polling location. My job became translation and coordination, helping different groups understand that they were working toward the same objectives even when they were speaking completely different languages. But the real challenge wasn't bureaucratic, it was temporal. 90 days seemed like an impossible timeline when we'd started, and 60 days felt like a death sentence as we got deeper into implementation. The breakthrough came during a visit to Hamilton County, a mid-sized district that had been struggling with the new voter verification requirements. They'd spent weeks trying to implement the technology solutions recommended by state vendors, but their system kept crashing, their poll workers couldn't figure out the interface, and their backup procedures were more complicated than their primary systems. "Show me what you were doing before the new requirements," I said, to Janet Morrison, the county election coordinator, who'd been running elections for 12 years and never encountered problems she couldn't solve until now. She walked me through their traditional verification process, which involved paper voter rolls, photo identification, and signature comparison procedures that had been refined over years of actual use. It was simple, efficient, and effective with built-in redundancy and clear audit trails. "This is actually excellent security," I told her. "You're verifying identity through multiple independent methods, you're maintaining clear documentation, and you're using procedures that your poll workers understand and can implement consistently."
But it doesn't meet the technology requirements, she said, pointing to the binders of specifications that had been provided by the state compliance team. "It meets the security requirements," I corrected. "The technology specifications are suggested implementation methods, not mandatory procedures. What you're doing achieves the same security objectives through different means." Over the following 2 weeks, we documented Hamilton County's procedures, analyzed their security effectiveness, and developed a compliance framework that demonstrated how traditional verification methods could meet federal standards without requiring expensive technology upgrades. The framework became a model for dozens of other counties that have been struggling with similar challenges. But the real test came when federal monitors arrived for their preliminary compliance review 6 weeks before the election. The lead monitor was a man named Dr. Richard Pemberton, a cybersecurity specialist from the Department of Homeland Security who'd spent his career evaluating theoretical security frameworks and had never actually administered an election. He arrived with a checklist of technology requirements and an expectation that every county would have implemented identical solutions. "I'm not seeing real-time database connectivity in most of your rural polling locations," he said during our initial briefing, consulting his tablet with the expression of someone who had discovered a fundamental flaw in our approach. "That's correct," I replied. "Rural polling locations are using enhanced paper-based verification systems with manual audit procedures that provide equivalent security through different mechanisms. But the federal guidelines specifically recommend database connectivity for voter verification." "The federal guidelines recommend database connectivity as one acceptable method for voter verification," I clarified. "They also explicitly allow for alternative verification methods that achieve equivalent security outcomes, which is exactly what these counties have implemented." Pemberton looked genuinely confused, as if he'd never considered that federal recommendations might be adapted to local circumstances. "Dr. Pemberton," I continued, "let me show you something." I pulled out the compliance documentation we'd developed for Hamilton County, which demonstrated how their traditional verification procedures met every federal security requirement through methods that were actually more secure than the technology solutions other counties were struggling to implement. "Paper voter rules with signature verification provide positive identification that can't be hacked or compromised by system failures," I explained. "Photo identification requirements eliminate the possibility of impersonation. Manual check-in procedures create an audit trail that's immediately accessible and completely transparent. Multiple poll worker verification prevents single points of failure. These procedures meet every federal security objective, and they do it using methods that poll workers understand and can implement reliably." Pemberton studied the documentation for nearly an hour, cross-referencing our procedures against federal requirements and trying to find gaps in our compliance framework. Finally, he looked up with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been respect. "This is actually more secure than most of the technology solutions I've been reviewing," he admitted. "The redundancy is better, the audit trail is clearer, and the failure points are more manageable." "That's because it was designed by people who actually run elections," I said, "instead of being designed by people who think about election security in the abstract." Over the following 3 days, Pemberton visited polling locations across 6 counties, observing verification procedures, reviewing documentation, and testing audit protocols. What he found was a network of election administration systems that achieved federal security objectives through locally appropriate methods implemented by people who understood both the requirements and the practical constraints of running elections in their specific communities. His final report recommended that our compliance framework be adopted as a model for other states facing similar implementation challenges. More importantly, he certified that our election procedures met all federal security requirements and were ready for implementation. The real validation came on Election Day, when 67 counties across the state conducted elections using procedures that had been adapted to their local circumstances while meeting federal security standards. Voter verification worked smoothly, audit procedures functioned correctly, and the entire process was completed without the technology failures, procedural confusion, or administrative disasters that everyone had been expecting. But the most meaningful moment for me happened at the Riverside Community Center, where I spent Election Day working as a poll worker alongside Mrs. Henderson, Frank Morrison, and Patricia Kelman. Using procedures that we'd helped develop, serving voters we'd been registering for months, in a building where I'd spent countless hours learning what democracy actually looked like at the community level. "You know what's funny?" Patricia said during a quiet moment between waves of voters. 6 months ago, I thought running elections was about following procedures correctly. Now I understand it's about protecting people's rights effectively. "Same goal, different perspective," I replied, watching a young father help his daughter feed their ballot into the scanner. Sometimes the best way to follow procedures correctly is to understand why the procedures exist in the first place. That evening, as we finished counting ballots and completing audit documentation, Frank Morrison raised the question that had been on my mind for weeks. "Elena, now that this crisis is over, are you going back to federal work? Are you going to keep the state position?" I looked around the community center, at the voting booths we'd set up that morning, at the registration materials we'd been using for months, at the people who'd become my partners in work that mattered more than any policy paper I'd ever written. "I'm going to keep doing both," I said. "The state work ensures that counties have the support they need to protect voting rights. The community work ensures that I never forget why protecting those rights matter in the first place." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "So we're not losing our Tuesday volunteer?" "You're never losing your Tuesday volunteer. But now she comes with better connections when you need help navigating state requirements."
Over the following months, that dual role became the foundation for a new approach to election administration that prioritized local autonomy while maintaining security standards. Counties developed procedures that worked for their specific circumstances. State agencies provided support and coordination rather than mandates and compliance monitoring.
Federal requirements became frameworks for achieving objectives rather than rigid specifications for implementation methods. Most importantly, the people doing the actual work of democracy, the volunteers and part-time coordinators and civic-minded citizens who showed up because they believed in the process, were treated as partners in protecting voting rights rather than obstacles to be managed or replaced. The approach worked so well that other states began adopting similar frameworks, and I found myself traveling to communities across the country, helping local election officials develop procedures that balanced security requirements with practical constraints. But no matter how far I traveled or how complex the implementation challenges became, I always returned to Riverside Falls on Tuesday mornings to fold voter registration forms and help people understand their rights as citizens. Because that's where democracy actually happens, in the daily work of neighbors, helping neighbors participate in the process that makes all the other work possible. And sometimes the most important thing you can do to protect democratic institutions is to remember that they're not abstract concepts or policy frameworks. They're living systems sustained by ordinary people who do extraordinary work because they believe in something larger than themselves. 5 years after that first award ceremony, I was standing in the Rose Garden of the White House, watching the president sign the Community Election Security Act into law. The legislation enshrined the principles we'd developed in Riverside County into federal policy, establishing frameworks that allowed local communities to meet security requirements through methods that matched their resources and circumstances. It was surreal to see language I'd helped draft in conference rooms across small-town America become the foundation for how the entire nation approached election administration. The signing ceremony was attended by election officials from every state, representatives from voting rights organizations, and technology companies that had learned to develop solutions for rural communities rather than just urban markets. But the moment that mattered most to me came when the president handed me one of the signing pens, acknowledging that the legislation had grown out of work that started with volunteers in community centers who refused to accept that effective election security required choosing between accessibility and integrity. "General Carter," the president said as photographers captured the moment, "this law exists because you understood that the best security comes from people who care about protecting democracy, not from people who care about selling expensive solutions to problems that don't actually exist." Standing next to me was Margaret Stevenson, who'd been promoted to Director of State Election Operations, and Dr. Richard Pemberton, who left the Department of Homeland Security to establish a nonprofit organization focused on helping rural communities develop appropriate election security procedures. The federal monitor who'd arrived in our state expecting to find technology failures had become one of the strongest advocates for community-centered approaches to election administration. But the people I was thinking about during that ceremony weren't in the Rose Garden. They were back in Riverside Falls, setting up tables for the weekly citizenship class that had grown from a monthly event to a program that served immigrants from 12 different countries. Mrs. Henderson was probably explaining naturalization procedures to someone who'd been studying for months to pass the civics exam. Frank Morrison was likely helping a new citizen register to vote for the first time. Patricia Kellman was probably organizing materials for the voter registration drive scheduled for the following weekend. The work continued, day after day, in community centers and libraries and church basements across the country, carried out by people who might never receive awards or recognition, but who understood that democracy required constant tending by ordinary citizens willing to do extraordinary work. The success of our implementation model had created opportunities I'd never anticipated. Universities started inviting me to speak about practical approaches to public administration. Think tanks wanted to study how we'd bridged the gap between policy and practice. International organizations asked for advice on developing election security frameworks for emerging democracies.
But the invitation that meant the most came from a group I'd never heard of until they contacted my office. The American Association of Election Volunteers was exactly what it sounded like, a network of people who staffed polling locations, organized voter registration drives, and supported election administration in communities across the country. They held an annual conference that rotated between small cities, bringing together hundreds of volunteers who rarely received recognition for work that made democracy possible. "We want you to be our keynote speaker," said the association president, a retired teacher named Maria Santos, who'd been coordinating elections in her community for 15 years. "Not because you're a general or because you have a fancy federal title, but because you understand what it's like to be the person setting up tables at 6 in the morning and cleaning up ballot boxes at midnight." The conference was held in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in a convention center that had seen better decades. The attendees were exactly the people I'd been working with for years, volunteers who showed up because someone had to do the work, not because they were building careers or pursuing recognition. They ranged in age from college students organizing voter registration drives on campus to retirees who'd been running polling locations since before electronic voting existed. My speech was scheduled for the final evening, after 2 days of workshops on everything from accessibility requirements to conflict resolution techniques for dealing with angry voters. But the session that affected me most deeply was a panel discussion called "Why We Do This Work," featuring volunteers from communities that had faced natural disasters, cyber attacks, equipment failures, and political pressures that had tested their commitment to fair and accessible elections. The panelist who stayed with me was a woman named Jennifer Walsh from a rural Louisiana parish that had been devastated by hurricanes 3 times in 5 years. Each time, their election infrastructure had been destroyed, and each time, volunteers had rebuilt it from scratch, often using their own resources and working out of damaged buildings to ensure that democratic participation continued even when everything else had collapsed. People ask me why I keep volunteering when it's such thankless work, but I've seen what happens to communities when people can't participate in decisions that affect their lives. Democracy isn't something that just happens automatically. It requires people who are willing to show up and do the work, especially when it's difficult. That evening, I spoke to an audience of 600 volunteers about the paradox of expertise in democratic societies. How the most important knowledge often comes from people who are closest to the actual work, rather than those who hold the highest credentials. How the best solutions usually emerge from understanding local circumstances rather than applying universal theories. How the most effective leadership frequently comes from people who've learned to listen before they speak and to serve before they lead. The framework that became federal law didn't originate in think tanks or policy institutes. It came from watching Mrs. Henderson explain voting procedures to elderly citizens who were confused by new requirements. It came from listening to Frank Morrison describe how to set up polling locations in buildings that weren't designed for elections. It came from learning from Patricia Kelman about the difference between following procedures and protecting rights. I paused, looking out at faces that reflected decades of experience in making democracy work at the ground level. "You are the experts," I continued. "You're the people who know whether procedures actually function in practice. You're the ones who understand what accessibility means for voters with disabilities, what language barriers look like in multilingual communities, what it takes to run elections in buildings without adequate power or internet connectivity. The most important election security expertise in this country isn't held by technology companies or federal agencies. It's held by people who've spent years learning how to solve problems with limited resources and unlimited dedication." The standing ovation that followed felt different from the polite applause I'd received at federal conferences or academic symposiums. These people understood what it meant to be underestimated, to have their knowledge dismissed because it came from experience rather than credentials, to watch expensive solutions fail while simple approaches succeeded. After my speech, I was approached by dozens of volunteers who wanted to share their own stories of being overlooked, undervalued, or ignored by officials who assumed that expertise required advanced degrees rather than practical knowledge. but they also shared stories of quiet victories, of problems solved through creativity and persistence, of communities strengthened by people who refused to accept that effective election security required choosing between accessibility and integrity.
A young man named David Chen, no relation to the Navy SEAL who'd recognized Samuel Kane's tattoo, approached me during the closing reception with a question that cut straight to the heart of everything I'd been thinking about for years. "General Carter," he said, "I'm finishing my master's degree in public administration, and I've been offered positions with consulting firms that work on election security contracts. Good money, prestigious clients, opportunities to influence policy at the highest levels. But after listening to your speech and attending these workshops, I'm wondering if I should instead find a way to work directly with communities like the ones represented here. How do you decide between having influence and having impact?" It was exactly the question I'd been wrestling with since that first morning when I decided to volunteer at the Riverside Community Center instead of accepting consulting contracts that would have paid more in a month than I made in a year from state work. "David," I said, "influence and impact aren't mutually exclusive, but they often require different approaches. The consulting work will give you access to decision-makers and policy processes, but it might also distance you from the people who are affected by those decisions. Community work will connect you directly to the problems that need solving, but it might limit your ability to change systemic issues that require high-level intervention. So how do you choose?" "You don't choose," I replied. "You find ways to do both. You work at the community level to understand what actually needs to be fixed, and then you work at the policy level to create frameworks that make those fixes possible. You use your credentials to get into rooms where decisions are made, but you never forget that the most important expertise comes from people who are implementing those decisions in the real world." 6 months later, David Chen contacted me about a position with the state election implementation program I'd helped establish. He'd turned down the consulting offers and spent those months volunteering with election organizations in rural communities across 3 states, learning about implementation challenges that weren't covered in any of his graduate courses. His application letter included endorsements from volunteer coordinators who'd watched him adapt theoretical knowledge to practical constraints, developing solutions that worked for actual communities rather than theoretical models. He became part of a new generation of public servants who understood that effective policy required constant connection to the people who were responsible for implementation. Under his coordination, the state program expanded to include fellowship opportunities for graduate students who wanted to learn about election administration by working directly with community volunteers rather than just studying abstract frameworks. The approach was so successful that other states began establishing similar programs, creating pathways for people with policy expertise to develop practical knowledge and for people with practical knowledge to influence policy development. Within 3 years, there was a national network of programs that ensured policymakers had direct experience with implementation challenges and that community volunteers had access to resources and support that respected their expertise rather than dismissing it. But the change that meant the most to me personally came during a routine Tuesday morning at the Riverside Community Center, 7 years after Margaret Stevenson had announced my award in that same room. I was helping a young mother register to vote for the first time when she mentioned that she'd heard about our voter registration program from her citizenship class instructor. She told us that this was the place to come if we wanted to register because the volunteers here actually care about helping people understand the process rather than just getting them to fill out forms, the woman explained as I helped her navigate the registration requirements. "Who was your instructor?" I asked. "Mrs. Chen. She's amazing. She's been teaching citizenship classes for years, and she really makes sure everyone understands not just how to pass the test, but what it means to be an active citizen." I looked up from the registration form, recognizing the name but not immediately placing it. "She used to be a high school history teacher," the woman continued, "but she retired a few years ago and started volunteering with immigrant services. Her son works for the state election office, and she says he learned everything he knows about public service from watching her work with volunteers who care more about helping people than advancing their careers." That afternoon, I met Linda Chen, David's mother, a woman who'd spent 30 years teaching high school civics and had discovered that retirement meant having more time to practice what she'd been preaching. She'd been conducting citizenship preparation classes at the community center for 2 years, but she'd been doing it quietly, without fanfare, in the same way I'd been folding voter registration forms before anyone knew my background. "Your son mentioned that you were the one who inspired his interest in public service," I said, as we cleaned up after her evening citizenship class. Linda smiled with the warmth of someone who'd spent decades watching young people discover their potential. David always wanted to make a difference, but he thought that meant getting important titles and working on big projects. It took him a while to understand that the most important work usually happens at the level where you can see the faces of the people you're helping. That's a lesson a lot of us had to learn the hard way. "Maybe," she said, arranging materials for the following week's class. "But once you learn it, you never forget it, and you never want to go back to work that doesn't connect you directly to the people who matter most." She was right. Despite opportunities to return to federal service, to lead policy institutes, or to establish consulting firms that would have made me wealthy, I'd discovered that the most satisfying work happened at the intersection of policy expertise and community engagement. The state position allowed me to influence systematic changes that protected voting rights across dozens of counties. The volunteer work kept me connected to the human impact of those changes and ensured that policy decisions were grounded in practical understanding rather than theoretical assumptions. That dual role had become a model that other experienced public servants were beginning to adopt. Former federal officials were taking state and local positions that allowed them to apply their expertise directly to community needs. Retired executives were volunteering with nonprofit organizations where their skills could support grassroots work. Academic researchers were spending sabbatical years working with community organizations to understand how their theories functioned in practice. The approach was creating a new form of public service that bridged the gap between expertise and implementation, between policy development and community engagement, between having credentials and having impact. It was also producing better outcomes for the communities that were supposed to benefit from public programs and policies. The validation for this approach came in unexpected ways. Research studies began documenting the superior effectiveness of programs that combined high-level expertise with community-based implementation. Academic journals started publishing articles about the importance of practice-informed policy development. Professional associations began requiring community engagement experience for certification in public administration fields. But the most meaningful recognition came from the communities themselves. Voter registration numbers increased in areas where volunteers felt supported and valued rather than managed and directed. Election security improved in counties where procedures were developed collaboratively rather than imposed bureaucratically. Civic engagement expanded in communities where expertise was shared rather than hoarded. The success created its own challenges.
As word spread about our approach, we were inundated with requests for technical assistance from communities across the country. Graduate students wanted to study our methods. Policy researchers wanted to document our procedures. Federal agencies wanted to scale our model to national programs. Managing that attention while protecting the community-centered principles that made the work effective required constant vigilance. We established criteria for sharing our expertise that prioritize community benefit over academic recognition. We developed training programs that emphasize listening and collaboration rather than instruction and direction. We created resource-sharing networks that allowed communities to learn from each other rather than becoming dependent on outside experts. Most importantly, we insisted that any expansion of our approach had to maintain the fundamental principle that the people closest to the work were the primary source of expertise about how to do that work effectively. 10 years after I had first walked into the Riverside Falls Community Center, the approach we'd developed had influenced election administration policies in 43 states and had been adapted for use in other areas of public service. The principles of community-centered expertise, collaborative policy development, and practice-informed implementation were being taught in graduate programs across the country. But the measure of success that mattered most to me was much simpler. On any given Tuesday morning, you could walk into community centers, libraries, and church basements across the country and find volunteers who felt valued for their knowledge, supported in their work, and confident that their contributions were making a meaningful difference in protecting democratic participation. You'd find election officials who understood that security and accessibility weren't competing priorities, but complementary objectives that required local knowledge to achieve effectively.
You'd find policymakers who recognized that the best solutions emerged from collaboration between credentialed expertise and experiential wisdom. You'd find communities where civic engagement was thriving because people felt empowered rather than managed. That Tuesday morning in Riverside Falls, I was training a new volunteer named Sarah Martinez, a recent college graduate who'd moved to town to teach at the elementary school. She was enthusiastic about civic engagement, but nervous about making mistakes with voter registration procedures. "What if I give someone wrong information?" she asked, as I showed her how to help people update their registration when they moved within the county. "Then you correct it and help them get the right information," I replied. "The goal isn't to be perfect on your first day. The goal is to care enough to keep learning and improving." "But you must have made mistakes when you started, too, right?" I thought about that question, remembering the 8 months I'd spent quietly folding registration forms while Ms. Henderson called me Ellen and Patricia Kelman explained basic civic procedures to me like I'd never encountered them before. "Sarah," I said, "I made mistakes for decades before I learned the most important lesson about public service, which is that the people doing the work always know more about how to do it effectively than the people writing policies about how it should be done. Your job isn't to implement procedures perfectly. Your job is to help people exercise their rights effectively. And the best way to learn how to do that is to listen to the people you're trying to help and to the experienced volunteers who've been figuring out solutions to real problems for years." She nodded, but I could see she was still nervous about the responsibility. "Let me tell you something that might help," I continued. "The most important expertise you need for this work isn't knowledge about election law or administrative procedures. It's genuine concern for the people you're helping and willingness to admit when you don't know something so you can find the right answer. Everything else can be learned." 6 months later, Sarah Martinez had become one of the most effective volunteers at the community center, not because she'd memorized all the procedures, but because she'd learned to connect with people who needed help and to ask experienced volunteers for guidance when she encountered situations she didn't understand. She'd also started a voter registration program at the elementary school that helped parents and community members get registered while they were dropping off or picking up their children. Her success illustrated something I'd been thinking about for years. The most important civic leadership often came from people who didn't think of themselves as leaders, who simply cared enough about their communities to show up and do whatever work needed to be done. The titles and credentials and formal recognition were less important than the willingness to engage with problems that affected people's lives and to persist until those problems were solved. Standing in the community center that Tuesday morning, watching Sarah help an elderly man update his voter registration, and listening to Ms. Henderson explain naturalization procedures to a group of citizenship candidates, I realized that the story that had started with my being underestimated and overlooked had evolved into something much more important. It had become a story about communities that valued expertise regardless of where it came from, about public service that prioritized impact over recognition, about democratic participation that was strengthened by people who understood that citizenship required constant engagement rather than periodic voting. The work continued day after day in small acts of service that rarely received attention, but that sustained the democratic institutions that made everything else possible. It was carried out by people who might never receive awards or recognition, but who understood that the most important victories were measured not in personal advancement, but in communities that functioned more effectively and citizens who felt more empowered to participate in decisions that affected their lives. That evening, as I drove home from the community center, past the houses and schools and businesses that made up the community I'd chosen to serve, I thought about how different my life had become from what I'd planned when I'd first retired from federal service. I'd expected to spend my remaining years quietly, anonymously, helping with small tasks that needed to be done. Instead, I discovered that there was no such thing as small tasks when they were connected to something as fundamental as democratic participation. Every voter registration form, every citizenship ceremony, every election security procedure was part of a larger system that protected the rights and freedoms that made community life possible. The work had taught me that expertise without community connection was merely theoretical, that policy without practical understanding was often counterproductive, and that the most important leadership came from people who were willing to be underestimated while they focused on getting the work done correctly. Most importantly, it had shown me that the choice between having influence and having impact was a false choice. The real challenge was finding ways to use whatever influence you'd earned to amplify the impact of people who were already doing the essential work, often without recognition or support. In small community centers across the country, that work continued every day, carried out by volunteers who understood that democracy required their constant attention and participation. They might never receive awards or recognition, but they were the foundation upon which everything else was built. And sometimes, the person folding voter registration forms at the corner table had spent decades learning how to protect the institutions that made that work possible for everyone. Sometimes being underestimated was exactly the perspective needed to remember what mattered most. And sometimes the most important civic leadership happened quietly, without fanfare, by people who showed up simply because someone had to do the work that made democracy possible for everyone else. 20 years later, I was standing at the same registration table where it all began, but this time, I wasn't the one being underestimated. The young woman across from me was explaining why she wanted to volunteer for voter registration drives, and her story sounded familiar in the best way possible. I just finished my master's in public policy, but I want to understand how democracy actually works before I start trying to fix it from some office building downtown. My professor said you were the person to talk to about learning from the ground up.
I smiled, remembering another conversation decades earlier when I'd been the one seeking to understand community work from someone who'd seemed like just another helpful volunteer. The community center looked different now, with updated technology and expanded programs, but the essential work remained the same. People still needed help registering to vote, understanding their rights, and navigating the systems that made civic participation possible. Emma had that eager energy that comes from believing you can change the world, combined with the humility to recognize you might not know how yet. It was exactly the combination that made for effective public service, whether you are working in community centers or federal agencies. What makes you think working here will teach you something you can't learn in graduate school? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Because graduate school teaches you theories about how things should work, she replied. But Mrs. Chen, my citizenship instructor, told me that democracy actually works because of people like you who show up every week to help their neighbors. She said if I wanted to develop policies that actually helped people, I needed to understand what help looked like from the perspective of the people receiving it. Mrs. Chen was Linda Chen, now in her 80s, but still teaching citizenship classes with the same passion she'd brought to high school civics decades earlier. Her son David had gone on to direct the National Community Election Security Initiative, but he still credited his mother's volunteer work as the foundation for everything he had accomplished in public service. The generational continuity was one of the most satisfying aspects of the work we'd built in Riverside Falls. Young people like Emma were learning about civic engagement from veterans like Linda, who'd learned from people like Mrs. Henderson, who'd been doing this work since before most of us had arrived in town. The knowledge passed down wasn't just about procedures and protocols, but about the deeper principles that made democracy sustainable across decades and centuries. Emma, I said, the most important thing you'll learn here isn't how to fill out voter registration forms correctly, though that matters. It's how to see each person who walks through that door as someone whose participation makes the entire system stronger. Every single vote matters, not because of who wins elections, but because the act of voting connects people to the community decisions that affect their daily lives. Over the following months, I watched Emma discover what I'd learned decades earlier, that the most profound expertise often belonged to people who'd never held impressive titles, but who'd spent years solving real problems with limited resources. She learned from Frank Morrison, now retired but still helping with accessibility issues, how to make voting processes work for people with disabilities. She learned from Patricia Kelman about managing the logistics of large-scale voter registration events. She learned from Dorothy Michaels about the historical context that made current civic challenges understandable. But most importantly, she learned to listen before offering solutions, to ask questions before making assumptions, and to value practical wisdom as much as theoretical knowledge. These lessons would serve her well regardless of whether she ended up working in community organizations, government agencies, or private consulting firms. The day Emma registered her 100th voter, we celebrated at the local coffee shop that had become an informal gathering place for volunteers. As we talked about her plans after the internship ended, she asked a question that brought everything full circle. General Carter, do you ever regret not staying in federal service? Do you ever wonder what you might have accomplished if you'd remained at the highest levels of government? I thought about that question, considering the policy frameworks that had emerged from our community-based work, the election security improvements that had spread across the country, the new generation of public servants who understood the connection between expertise and empathy. Emma, I said, I did stay in federal service. I just redefined what that meant. Every person we help register to vote participates in federal elections. Every citizenship ceremony we support creates new participants in federal democracy. Every local election security improvement protects federal democratic institutions. The work we do here has national impact, but it's grounded in local relationships and community understanding. So you think local work and national impact aren't contradictory? I think they're inseparable, I said. The strongest federal policies emerge from understanding local realities. The most effective national programs are designed by people who've seen how similar programs work or fail at the community level. You can't protect democracy from the top down, but you can strengthen it from the bottom up in ways that transform entire systems. Emma nodded thoughtfully, already planning how she'd apply these insights to whatever came next in her career. She'd go on to work for a nonprofit organization focused on voting rights, bringing both policy expertise and community experience to advocacy work that achieved meaningful legislative victories. But she'd also continue volunteering at community centers wherever her career took her, maintaining the connection between grassroots work and policy development that had become essential to her understanding of effective public service. The day Emma registered her 100th voter, we celebrated at the local coffee shop that had become an informal gathering place for volunteers. As we talked about her plans after the internship ended, she asked a question that brought everything full circle. General Carter, do you ever regret not staying in federal service? Do you ever wonder what you might have accomplished if you'd remained at the highest levels of government? I thought about that question, considering the policy frameworks that had emerged from our community-based work, the election security improvements that had spread across the country, and the new generation of public servants who understood the connection between expertise and empathy. Emma, I did stay in federal service. I just redefined what that meant. Every person we help register to vote participates in federal elections. Every citizenship ceremony we support creates new participants in federal democracy. Every local election security improvement protects federal democratic institutions. The work we do here has national impact, but it's grounded in local relationships and community understanding. So you think local work and national impact aren't contradictory? I think they're inseparable, I said. The strongest federal policies emerge from understanding local realities. The most effective national programs are designed by people who've seen how similar programs work or fail at the community level. You can't protect democracy from the top down, but you can strengthen it from the bottom up in ways that transform entire systems. Emma nodded thoughtfully, already planning how she'd apply these insights to whatever came next in her career. She'd go on to work for a nonprofit organization focused on voting rights, bringing both policy expertise and community experience to advocacy work that achieved meaningful legislative victories. But she'd also continue volunteering at community centers wherever her career took her, maintaining the connection between grassroots work and policy development that had become essential to her understanding of effective public service. The day Emma registered her 100th voter, I walked through the community center one more time, past the registration tables and voting machines, the citizenship classroom, and the community meeting room. The building was quiet, but it would be busy again the next morning with volunteers preparing for the weekend's registration drive. This was where I'd learned that being underestimated could be a superpower, that expertise without humility was often counterproductive, and that the most important work usually happened without recognition or applause. It was also where I discovered that retirement didn't mean stepping away from meaningful work, but rather finding new ways to contribute that honored both the knowledge you'd gained and the community that sustained you. The story that had begun with my being dismissed as just another helpful volunteer had evolved into something much larger, a model for how experienced professionals could remain engaged in public service while learning from the communities they served. It had shown that the choice between influence and impact was false, that the most effective leadership often came from people who were willing to work alongside others rather than directing them from above. Years from now, other volunteers would discover their own ways to bridge the gap between expertise and community engagement, between policy development and practical implementation, between personal accomplishment and collective impact.
They'd learn, as I had, that democracy required constant tending by people who understood that citizenship was not a spectator sport, but a participatory responsibility. The work would continue, carried forward by people who might never receive recognition, but who understood that the most important victories were measured in communities that functioned more effectively and citizens who felt more empowered to shape the decisions that affected their daily lives. And sometimes, the person quietly folding registration forms in the corner would turn out to be exactly the expert the community needed, waiting patiently to be discovered and invited to share what they'd learned from a lifetime of service.